So we're now live, so people will be able to see us, but
we are live and live streaming.
right. So how are things in Piracicaba these days, though? How's the traffic situation?
It's getting better.
It's getting better.
Better and better.
Oh.
That's all I can say to you. No, I'm kidding. It's fine. It's good. But things are good. Are quiet. So we are in lockdown. Almost a lockdown here in São Paulo State.
Yeah. Well, I did see that there was unfortunately, there was more than 3,000 people died in Brazil yesterday. So that was a very, I know just a few months ago we were in the same position with, so
yeah.
But I think the case numbers in the U.S. are actually going up again. So even though we've we're solving our vaccine rollout, I think a little bit, we still have quite a problem. So
yeah.
Connie and Everton, are you Sao Paulo state natives? Or are you yeah? How did you end up in Piracicaba at Izalki?
I am originally from São Paulo city, but then because of my husband's work, first I moved to Ribeirão Preto and then to Piracicaba in 2016.
Okay.
And I'm here ever since.
Oh, great.
I am origin in Rio das Pedras, a little city near to Piracicaba.
Okay. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We got 2 more minutes before we get started, so just hang out here. I know looks like we have 20 people who are in the room right now, so we'll get going here at the webinar with our friends and colleagues from Izalki Log here in 2 minutes. Well, everyone, it's 9 o'clock where I am in Ames, Iowa, in the United States. My name's Kyle Poorman, and I'm with the Consortium for Innovation in Post-Harvest Loss and Food Waste Reduction. I am so excited to have you all today and to have you here for our first of 2 Brazilian agrologistic webinars that we're having on post-harvest loss and emerging issues, mostly focused on Brazil. And we are really excited to have our friends and colleagues from Agrolog here today with us. We'll be having 3 presentations on our webinar today on the 24th of March, and then there'll be 2 additional presentations on April 7th. So mark your calendars in your computers, April 7th. Anyway, during this webinar, we will have presentations from Fernando Rocha, Dr. Fernando Rocha, just received his PhD, and congratulations to Fernando, Connie Sue, and Everton Costa. So we'll be looking forward to those in just a second. Before that, I just want to go through some housekeeping measures. Again, welcome. As always, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed. And so afterwards, or for those that miss it, you can view it on the consortium's YouTube channel. Just a bit about the consortium. There are 9 institutional members and 2 major funders, the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and the Rockefeller Foundation. We would like to thank our major funders and also each one of our institutions who are also bringing their own funds to the consortium. Along with our member institutions, we also have consortium collaborators, and we would like to thank our consortium collaborators, which range from large multinational companies to institutions to NGOs working across the world. Thank you, collaborators. Anyway, our first presentation will be from Dr. Fernando Rocha. He's here with us from Piracicaba, Brazil, and his presentation will be on post-harvest loss metrics for infrastructure investments. And I'd like to turn it over to Fernando now. Before I do that, I just want to say that we'd love to have a lively discussion in the chat. So if you have questions, chat function. We'll have a question and answer session at the end after all the presentations, but we'll try to have a kind of a free-flowing discussion in the chat while the webinar is going on. Okay, I'm turning it over to Fernando now. Thank you very much.
Oh, hello everybody. Hello everyone. Thanks, Kyle, for the introductions. I'm sharing my screen with you guys. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let's go. So my name is Fernando. I'm a researcher at the Agrolog Group. It's a pleasure being here today and presenting part of my PhD work that I defended last year. So the title of my presentation is Time to Consider Post-Harvest Loss Metrics in Assessing Infrastructure Projects. So as a background, we have seen in Brazil in a few years, in a few months, many discussions of new investments in transport infrastructures, especially in agribusiness sector. So the agricultural sector is really important to my country. And of course, each each new infrastructure project has its relationship with social benefits, economic benefits, and also environmental impacts. So based on that idea, the main goal of my thesis in my PhD was to create an analysis of relative efficiency and compare 26 multimodal transport infrastructure projects for soybean transportation in Brazil. And this comparison is based on social, environmental, and economic aspects. So this background, we have seen in the transport international literature that the works that have been analyzing new infrastructures for cargo transportation or people transportation have more and more working with social development issues and also environmental impacts issues. So it's a trend in the last few years to have these economic, social, and environmental aspects together when we are analyzing new transportation infrastructure projects or investments all around the world. And so, based on that, we have more and more discussing the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have 17 different goals to reach worldwide. And based on that, based on this idea and on this background, what if we decide to include post-harvest loss metrics in assessing transportation infrastructure projects? So with this idea, we could be closer to some goals related to sustainable development, like zero hunger, climate actions, economic growth, and infrastructure, as highlighted in this slide. So very quickly, I will not take too much time in this, but to compare the projects, I used the data development analysis, DEA models. So very short, the DEA models give us an idea how a decision-making unit, in this case, the infrastructure projects, is using the inputs to perform a set number of outputs. So the better the usage of the inputs to produce the outputs, the better the efficiency of the decision-making units, again, in this case, the projects. And in my work, I did some models of economic efficiency, environmental efficiencies, social efficiency, and I had a global model with economic, environmental, and social data, and I will focus in this presentation to present this last model. And to do this analysis, I needed economic variables, as I listed here in this slide. So I have the potential cost reduction of each new transportation infrastructure, the amount of cargo handled by the infrastructure, and the handling capacity utilization rate of this new infrastructure projected. I also needed some environmental variables like total CO2 emissions during transport operations and total soybean loss during transport operations. And also I needed some social variables, and I used the area of influence of each infrastructure and an estimative of the impact in the human development indexes due to the decrease in average transport costs in some cities in the influence area of the infrastructure. So this is the data I used. And of course, as an input in the efficiency model, I used the cost of the investment. So the better the efficiency of a project is, the better use of the total cost of the investment to produce these 7 outputs that I listed in this slide. And to have this data, I created a transportation model to minimize the soybean transport costs in Brazil. And based on this model, it's a network equilibrium model, I simulated 26 scenarios, and I simulated the impact in these variables to every project, to every new infrastructure project in Brazil that we have been discussing nowadays. So very quickly, this is the model, the network equilibrium model, the transport system. The model includes, since the places that are producing soybean in Brazil nowadays until the final destination in the domestic market and in the foreign market. So it's the full supply chain in terms of soybean transportation. This is the equations of the model. It's a optimization model. We have objective functions. We have some model constraints. We have another equations, and I highlighted in these slides the equations related to the estimatives of post-harvest loss during transport operations. So these equations give me the number that I needed to the efficiency models. And this is the mathematical structure of the DEA models that I used. And I'm comparing, in these cases, the infrastructure projects. So I have 26 railway and waterway strats projects, and I'm comparing them based on that variables I showed before, using these 2 data development models, DEA models that I'm showing here. So in terms of the result, the main findings, this slide shows the current situation in Brazil. So this is the current infrastructure to move soybean in Brazil. So we have an average cost in Brazil is something like 155 reais per ton, is something like $35 per ton to move soybean in Brazil, is the average cost of the global transportation solution. In the map, the points in red are the points with the higher average transportation cost. So we have some red points and orange points in Mato Grosso state, in the middle region in Brazil. So in this place concentrates the cities, the soybean farmers that pay more to move cargo, to move soybean to domestic and foreign market. And in the last point here in this slide, in the current situation in Brazil, we are losing something like 433,000 tons of soybean during transport operations. So that number came from the model, network equilibrium model, and this number represents something like 0.37% of our production. And I'm not considering the losses during harvest, the losses during storage, just road, railway, and waterway transportations, and of course the transshipment terminals are included. And these are the results, some of the results related to the simulation of the impacts of each scenario. So in this slide, I'm showing you the potential of the transportation cost reduction for soybean supply chain in Brazil for each scenario. So I highlight the top 3 scenarios here, and the two scenarios related to Ferrogrão project is a very this project have been more and more discussing by federal government, by private agents in the market. The one scenario of Ferrogrão could decrease the soybean transportation costs in Brazil in something like 1 billion reais per year. And Ferrogrão, the other scenario, it's also important as the scenario related to the FICO and FNS railway. I will talk a little bit more in details about the scenarios in the future slides. This is the central topic of this presentation. So this is the estimates of physical losses of soybean during transport operation in Brazil in each scenario with infrastructure. In this case, I highlighted the main scenarios, and in these cases, the lower the level of soybean physical loss, the greater is the efficiency of the project. We don't want a project with that increasing and more the physical losses during transportation in Brazil. And we have highlighted here 2 scenarios related to the expansion of Malha Norte railway in Brazil, also in Mato Grosso, and one scenario related to the North and South railway in Brazil, but in the southern part of the country. And last result in this that I'm showing this presentation is the total CO2 emissions in tons of CO2, and Ferrogrão and Paraense railway are the scenarios with the better numbers in terms of CO2 emissions during transport operations in Brazil. So these are 3 examples of results that came from the network equilibrium model that I did, and I'm going to use this and the other variables in the data envelopment analysis in the model of the efficiency. So I will speak just about the model that uses economic, environmental, and social variables to have the efficiency, because this is a global model, as I can say, a global model, because it's including the 3 categories of variables, and we have the global efficiency, as we can say, about each scenario. So this is the results in numbers of the data DEA models, but I will focus my explanation in this slide. I selected here the top 10 scenarios in the top 4 projects that are related to these scenarios. And in terms of the global efficiency score I'm presenting in this slide, we have the top 1 project. It's Malha Norte railway expansion. It's the number 1 in this map over here. It's the central part of Mato Grosso state. The second well-ranked scenario, the project, is the waterway of Marabá in Pará state. is the number 2 in this map, is the north part of Brazil, in Pará state. The number 3 is a scenario that mix investments in FNS and FICO projects in the number 3. And the number 4 presented here is the Ferrogrão project that links Mato Grosso to Pará states and to handle cargo using the ports in the northern part of the country. So this is the global efficiency result. So, and based on that, assuming that this global result gives us an idea about the sustainability of the projects, because it's considered economic, social, and environmental variables. These are the top 4 projects when we have ranking the projects to new development of new public policies, new investments, and this kind of thing. And this is my last slide. I tried to be very quickly, very fast during my presentation. We have 2 more presentations here in this webinar. And for future analysis, broader approaches in the analysis and definitions of public investment policy in cargo transportation in Brazil we're demanding broader approaches that include economic, social, and environmental variables. So in this case, we can be closer to some sustainable development goals that we have been more and more emphasizing in the last few years. And another point I would like to highlight is related to the usage of data envelopment analysis, DA models, in post-harvest loss studies. So this method, these models could be applied in post-harvest loss, could be applied to compare post-harvest loss technologies and practices, could be applied to compare countries in terms of how efficient they are tackling post-harvest loss issues. And one other great point of this technique is the possibility to use different variables from different fields related to the sustainable development goals, as zero hunger, climate actions, infrastructure, many others. So I have, in my point of view, DEA models is not used in a large scale in applications with post-harvest loss studies, and myself and other ExalcLog members could and have interested in helping many different studies around the world applying this technique to perform post-harvest losses analysis. So again, I try to be very fast. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Fernando. You were very, very fast and very efficient, and excellent presentation. Again, if there are questions for Fernando now, we'll take them at the end and we'll discuss them out loud, but you can put them in the chat right now already. For our next presentation, we'll go to Connie Sue. Connie, are you ready? Go ahead.
Yes, okay. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Connie. I am a researcher here at ExalcLog, and I'm currently a PhD student in applied economics. And today I'm going to talk about the driving factors behind post-harvest losses of grains. So first things first, I'm going to talk about some definitions that I'm going to be using today. So post-harvest losses here are defined as the unintentional decrease in the quantity of food produced for human consumptions at all stages of the food supply chain, regardless of the cause or destination, and not including retail and final consumption stages. And the food supply chain is the series of activities needed to deliver food through multiple stages: production, handling, storage, processing, distribution, retailing, from farm to the final consumer. In the literature, it's usually also distinguishes food losses from food waste, as in food loss occurs in the early stages of the food supply chain, while food waste happens in retail markets or after it reaches consumer, and is generally related to behavior. In developing and transitional countries, early stage food loss is greater than food waste, while food waste is greater than food loss in developed and industrialized countries. And we can see this perception when we plot the average food loss of grains versus the gross domestic product per capita, which expresses the economic development level of a country. So we can kind of clearly see here that lower income countries does have higher levels of post-harvest losses than higher income countries. And now, why do we need to reduce post-harvest losses? Because it allows us to improve food security and food safety, to reduce the unnecessary resource use, and thus increasing environmental sustainability. And also, we can increase the food supply chain actors' profits and well-being. But great. Now, how can we reduce post-harvest losses? There are several studies in the literature addressing this issue, but most of them address it in a qualitative way, mainly due to the difficulty to obtain the necessary data. Accurate measuring methods are costly and demand high levels of effort, making it difficult to measure losses of several food crops in numerous locations. So what we tried to understand here was how macroeconomic conditions influence post-harvest losses of grains, as in rice, maize, soybeans, and wheat, which are the four grains with the highest production. And we chose grains because they are the main source of food for humans and animals. To find the main determinants of post-harvest losses of grains, we constructed an econometric model using global level annual data with the necessary corrections. And we also performed 2 sets of robustness checks to assess the validity and sensitivity of the results. We used a data set of data from years 2000 through 2011, 42 countries with relevant grains production. And all data used in this study was publicly available from Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Bank, and UNESCO. Mainly FAO's food balance sheets and the suite of food security indicators. These are the main results that we obtained with our model. Now, I know it's a lot of numbers and I'm not going to enter into details, but I'm going to talk about the main results and discussions that we found. We found that the highest impact on post-harvest losses are due to variation on GPD per capita. An increase in a country's GPD per capita leads to an increase in economic access to food for the poorest, a dietary transition from starchy food staples to perishable food, economic development, investments on logistics infrastructure, intensely reducing grains post-harvest loss. And this impact is nonlinear and varies according to economic development cluster and culture. So, for instance, here in orange and blue are our baseline models. So here we can see that a low-income country has a 45% higher level of post-harvest loss than a high-income country. And an upper middle income country has almost 32% higher level of losses than a high income country. So the economic development level of a country is the main determinant in the post-harvest loss of grains. Now, the urbanization rate has a moderate effect on reducing post-harvest loss. Although urbanization may cause the contraction of a country's agricultural sector, the benefits derived from an improved infrastructure and a more efficiently operated supply chain bring about a reduction of post-harvest losses that more than counterbalances the migration of agricultural workers to growing urban centers. In the same sense as before, a low urbanization country has almost 30% higher level of post-harvest losses than a high urbanization rate country. The next determinant in importance is the dummy variable that we created to represent the economic crisis that happened between 2008 and 2011. So the lack of stability due to this economic and food price spikes increased post-harvest losses by affecting consumer purchasing power and by putting investments on hold. And the next determinant is a country's openness to international trade of food. And it also has a moderate impact on post-harvest loss. In order to compete globally in the commodity market, packaging and operation procedures must meet international norms. And these standards are often an improvement over local practices in developed countries and more appropriate to the maintenance of product attributes, both nutrition and in appearance, thereby lowering post-harvest losses and increasing food security and food safety. So a country with a low openness to international trade has almost 25% higher level of post-harvest loss than a country with a high level of openness to international trade. So some additional remarks to conclude this work. We found that there is a difficult trade-off involved when countries seek to increase the availability of basic foods to feed increasing population, because without proper post-harvest infrastructure, especially in food storage and food marketing, a country's efforts to increase food supply can lead to increase in the level of post-harvest loss. In addition, as a country develops economically, there is concurrent non-linear post-harvest loss reduction in all analyzed dimensions, as we could see in the table previously presented. And the construction of infrastructures such as storage facilities in developing countries, along with the transfer of knowledge and technologies from industrialized countries, has led to the reduction in post-harvest losses. And lastly, all data used in this work came from reliable, internationally recognized sources, and the results were robust to shocks. However, it's really important to keep working in the improvement of data standardization and the improvement of quality of the post-harvest losses data, as it will reduce estimation biases and allow agents and governments to make more informed decisions and researchers to make more accurate estimates. If you're interested to find more details about this work, it was published in the Sustainable Production and Consumption Journal. And any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Connie. We'll have questions at the end, but feel free to put them in the chat, and if we can answer them in the chat, that'd be great. And if not, I know there are a number of questions for Fernando in the chat. But thank you, Connie, and I just want to comment on going from the qualitative that we relied upon to the quantitative, looking at that was great, Connie. So thank you for that. And now we'll move on to Mr. Everton Costa. Everton, are you ready for your presentation?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kyle, for introduction. I am Everton Costa, researcher at Exaltalog Group, and the theme of presentation is Environmental Impacts of Soy Supply Chain in Brazil. The agribusiness is one of the most important segments of the Brazilian economy. Its segments, inputs, agriculture, and service were responsible in 2019 for 21% of Brazilian GDP. And soy is one of the most relevant products among all agribusiness. Brazil is the second largest global player in the production of soybeans, behind only the United States. And the production in 2019 was greater than 114 million tons. And the soybean is the most relevant product of all national economy, representing 12% of the Brazilian export basket. And that export occurs mainly to China, Brazil's main trading partner. So the logistics is great obstacles to competitiveness gains in the Brazilian agribusiness. Logistics costs compromise on average 25% of the price of soybean. In addition, logistics transportation intensified important environmental impacts. Some characteristics of Brazilian logistics are crucial to enhance environmental damages. First, Brazil is very dependent on road transport. On average, 61% of Brazilian cargo movement is carried out by this model. And Brazil has a great challenge because has a continental size, and this is a problem because some important producing regions, as Mato Grosso state, for example, are located far from ports. For these regions, the consumption of the fossil fuel, especially diesel, is the main cause of the environmental damages in the transport sector, which is responsible for 7% of all carbon dioxide in Brazil, carbon dioxide emissions in Brazil. And some factors to this is the GDP, is the greenhouse gas emissions in Brazilian logistics sector are intensified by problems such as the advanced age of the truck fleet. Estimates from the Brazil National Transport Confederation indicates that the average age of the fleet is 15.2 years. And this is problematic because the trucks have obsolescence technologies and need to consume more diesel. In addition, the poor quality of the railways requires great fuel consumption and promotes an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. In Brazil, only 12.4% of the railways are paved, and of these 24% are classified as poor or very poor. So, in view of the economic importance of the soybean complex to Brazil and the potential environmental impacts of transport, it's necessary to analyze how the evolution of production affects the environmental degradation resulting from transport. For this, an analysis was performed in order to verify the validity of the assumptions of the environmental cost curve for transport of soybeans in Brazil. The traditional cost curve identifies the relationship between income and inequality. And considering that economic growth is the main responsible for reducing inequality, this is because in the transition from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, there is a greater concentration of income. But the achievement of regular levels of income improves the economic situation of rural society and increasing distribution and decreasing inequality. So the traditional cost curve has an inverted U shape. Beyond that, the environmental cost curve identifies a relationship between economic growth measured by income and environmental degradation. The initial environmental cost curve, AKC, points to an inverted U shape, which means that after the transition from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, in which there is intense use of natural resources, with the economic growth, there will be concern for the environmental, with the creation of environmental policies, green technologies, and consequently a decrease in the environmental degradation, illustrated by the inflection in the environmental cost curve. However, there is a possibility that economic growth will not be sufficient to contain environmental degradation in the longer run, making it possible for a new inflection in the AKC, giving rise to N-shaped curves. And three effects are responsible for the AKC formats. The scale effects relates the increase in production to increase in degradation. The composition effects considers that if there are more or less polluting activities in economy, such the service sector, for example, there is a possibility of reducing degradation. And the technological effects considers that the creation of new, less polluting technologies is responsible for reducing degradation. In this analysis, situations that increase the productivity of transport and decreasing of consumptions of fossil fuels, such as intermodality, are considered as technological effects. And the methodology of this analysis was constituted in 3 steps. The first step, a mathematical model to optimize soybean transport flows in Brazil. Second step, after defining the flows, carbon dioxide emissions were estimated. Thus, it was possible to elaborate dependent variable, which is carbon dioxide emissions in the transport of soybeans by the region of production. And the third step was to verify the environmental causes curve hypothesis using an econometric model. For the optimization model, 3 possible flows are considered. Transport exclusively by road from the origins to the ports, transport exclusively by road from the origins to the milling plants, and intermodal transport from the origins to the ports using transshipment terminals. The optimization model structure to minimize costs has restrictions related to supply and soybean production and demand, the capacity of the received soy in the ports, transshipment terminals, and milling plants. So the second step, after defining the flows, carbon dioxide emissions were calculated using specific emissions factors for road, water, and rail modes. After the elaboration of dependent variable, econometric analysis of panel data, of dynamic panel data was performed, and the cross-section units analyzed were the producing micro-regions by the sum of the municipal data, and the time period analyzed is from 2002 to 2017. And this estimation was performed by generalized methods of the moments, system GMM. The variables of interest in the model are those related to income. Thus, if in the quadratic function, the beta-1 coefficient are 0 or positive, and the beta-2 coefficient is negative and statistically significant, there is an inverted U-shaped environmental causes curve. But if in the cubic function, if the beta-1, beta-2, and beta-3 coefficients are greater than or equal to 0, less than or equal to 0, and greater than 0, respectively, there is an N-shaped environmental causes curve. The man finds, the rider production regions are responsible for more emissions in transport, suggestion of a scale effect, and emissions of carbon dioxide in region farthest from the ports, such as Mato Grosso state, are wider than in the most extreme regions, such as in the state of Paraná. The econometric analysis concludes that there is no validation of the environmental causes curve for inverted U-shape hypothesis, but there is the validation of the N format. This indicates that the economic growth is not enough to mitigate environmental degradation in transport. On the contrary, there is a predominance of the scale effect, and in the longer run, the greater the soybean production, the greater the environmental degradation caused by transport. By concept, this occurs when technological effects are obsolete, such as, for example, that the current intermodal infrastructure, which increases the productivity of the transport operation, is insufficient to mitigate the growth of the emissions in transport when there is an increase to production. Thus, the main conclusions points to the need to increase transport productivity, of the possibilities being investments in new transport infrastructure, in addition to searching for alternatives to reduce dependence on fossil fuels, incorporation of new technologies, and enforcement of environmental laws. So thank you very much for attention.
Thank you, Everton. Thank you for your presentation. And now we will go to our question and answer session. Just let me share my screen here. Just 1 second. All right, let me just get everything here. All right, sorry. I'll stop my sharing because I can't see the chat when I'm sharing. So if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat. Just from Tanya, I know you answered this in the chat, Fernando, but if you just talk a little bit about ground truthing, how much ground truthing you did, or so question A of Tanya's question, which is how much measured ground truthing data do you have to compare with the outcomes from your model? If you just want to just chat, answer that just a bit.
Yeah, related to this question, I post the answer in the chat, but just to answer to all, at Agrolog 3-4 years ago, we had a project to measure the soybean loss in transport operation, especially in trucks. So we analyzed a huge database from the main traders in Brazil, the weight data, and we also had field experience that we measured the grains of soybean that was loose during transport operation, and this is the grain that's spilling out of the truck during transport. So these numbers in general I used in the network equilibrium model in my work, and I also highlighted Thiago Pera's presentation in the next webinar. Thiago did his dissertation in this issue, so I think he will present and talk a little bit more about these numbers of soybean and grains loss during transport operations in Brazil.
Great. Thank you, Fernando. The next question also comes from Tanya, and it's for Connie. And she is basically asking, how did you manage concerns surrounding post-harvest loss data quality issues?
Hello, Tanya. Thanks for your question. We are aware that there are that the food balance sheet, especially the losses indicator, may not be precise, but what we tried to do was exclude the observations that had at least one missing data or outliers. And we try to minimize the number of excluded observations, filling the missing data with information from the same country or different periods. And we also try to with the robustness checks, we try to assure that even though the data wasn't like perfect in quality, but it did provide a robust model. And we also perform another sets of tests to ensure the quality of the model, like panel unit root tests, and Fisher type tests. And in the residuals, we perform tests of panel heteroscedasticity and autocorrelation. So that was basically how we try to tackle this question of the data. We basically selected the countries that had relevant production of those 4 grains, and as I said, we only excluded missing data observations, and we did not analyze by type of grain, and it could be a further analysis, but we analyzed all the 4 of them together.
Right, thank you, Connie, for that. Fernando, I have a question for you. I know that you kind of modeled projects that are in the pipeline, right? Were these 26 projects in the pipeline? And is this, I know that Isoculog and policymakers are quite interlocked, but is this kind of analysis being kind of looked at for investments in Brazilian agricultural infrastructure going forward, right? Is this the idea that it's a forward-looking thing?
Yeah, when we're talking about investments in infrastructure to move cargo, to transport cargo, especially in agribusiness and other sector, I think, but we have been discussing many projects related to the agribusiness sector in Brazil due to the importance of this industry. But when we are talking about these kind of investments, people are more concerned about the economic variables. So the cost of the project, what are the potential for cost reduction, what are the amount of cargo load by the infrastructure makes sense or not, and this kind of thing. And we have been discussing more and more, this issue has emerging, the environmental issues. So the CO2 emissions is, as Everton presented, it's an important topic. It's a highlighting topic in this discussion. And deforestation is another topic here in Brazil. So in this kind of analysis, we wanted to put together more variables, different kind of variables, to have a global rank of the projects. And in that 4 projects that I highlighted in my last slide, of course, they are the well-ranked projects, but in great part of the cases, they compete in the same region for cargo, for soybean. So sometimes when you analyze, if one project is started, the other projects, I will not start the investment, I increased my risk in this. We are having this kind of discussion current here in Brazil in terms of which project's better. So we have some economic metrics, environmental metrics, and they are competing for the same region. So the broader the approach, I think the better is the decision making to select some investments of a few number of investments.
Right. Connie, I was just wondering if the way you developed your model for grain, whether it would be applicable to perishable crops.
Yes, Kyle. We probably as the supply chain from perishables and grains are a little bit different in the sense that perishable generally require a cold chain, and so the structure would be pretty much the same, like the macroeconomic conditions, but maybe we should we need to add different variables to reflect, the perishable supply chain. But the idea would be from the same, but we have to make some adaptations considering the products in question.
Yeah, the supply chain's a bit more complicated, and the loss is much higher. Also, the data quality issues that Tanya brought up also would be a significant issue across many of those areas. But in general, I think that being able to quantify in grains, in grain, because we have this kind of qualitative idea that there's less loss in developed countries, but being able to quantify that, I think it's a really nice step forward. So I thought that was good. Everton, what are the next steps in this space of your environmental analysis of the transportation? What may be the next step? I know this is a big topic in Brazil, not only the emissions but the deforestation. So what are the kind of the next steps for you?
The projects of infrastructure must have an environmental vision as a main objective. Many projects are environmental beneficial because they generate a positive externality, but they are true at first to increase competitiveness and are necessary public policies for the inclusion of new technologies, creation partners to infrastructure projects to increase the productiveness of the transport operations, and this is necessary, and the main finding and the main suggestion of public policy.
Okay, thanks, Everton. I just have this question. It came up a number of times in your talk, and then Fernando talked about the age of the fleet that is generally moving transport, ag transport around Brazil. Is, Everton said the average age was 15, but many of them are maybe a quarter century old. Have you looked at how influencing that transition to newer trucks, or maybe railways, or that's it's just an open question, but I'm not sure if you've looked at that. Fernando, Everton, Connie, anyone? So
yeah, the average age of the Brazilian fleet truck, it's around 15 years old, as Everton presented, but we are not talking about the agricultural sector, especially for orange transportation, for grains transportation in some region. It is more, it can reach 25 years old. So we have many old trucks driving an important part of our transportation systems here in Brazil. In the recent years, we had tried to have some public policies to renew the transportation system, to decrease the average age of the fleet truck in Brazil. And of course, when you're talking about the increase of railway transportation, waterway transportations, we decrease the dependence of the road transportation sector, and maybe we can, together with these new public policies, we are trying to decrease this average number of the age of the trucks in Brazil. But this is sometimes is a problem. The truck, a great part of the trucks are old. They broken in the highways, for example. They have more CO2 emissions. They lose more cargo during transport operations. We have some social and environmental and also economic aspects related to this high average age of our fleet in Brazil. But we are trying to change it.
Yeah, I mean, also though, on the other hand of that, you've had a significant increase in production, especially in maize and soybeans over the last years as well. So I mean, it may also just be a function of needing more of those assets as well. I'm not sure, but you know, anyway, do you have any last thoughts on the webinar, Fernando, Connie, Everton, before I?
No, I think no last thoughts from me, from myself. And I also would like to highlight, so me, Everton, Connie, and myself, you are researcher at the Agrologistics Group. We have we have been working for many years with Agrologistics in Brazil, and we have some international experiences. The consortium is one of the experiences that we are having. And we are available for future questions, future partnerships, and we are really want to increase your international partnerships in agrologistics and also in post-harvest losses. This is my final message.
Right, sorry. I apologize for this. So I want to thank everyone for coming on being at this webinar. I want to thank Everton. I want to thank Fernando. I want to thank Connie. I want to thank Nicholas from the Ed Schneider Center at the University of Maryland, Cassie McGee from Iowa State University, and everyone who helped put this on, and their funders, the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research and the Rockefeller Foundation. Without them, we wouldn't have a consortium. Our next webinar will be with our friends and partners from Agrologistics again on 7th of April, 2021 at 11 a.m. Brasilia time. I think it's going to be an excellent webinar. Again, we have an overview of ethanol logistics, and then we have a modal share implications for post-harvest loss that Tiago did, and we discussed, and he did that in partnership with the USDA here in the United States. So without further ado, I want to thank everyone, and we will see you on the 7th. Again, this was a Consortium for Innovation Post-Harvest Loss Food Waste Reduction webinar series, and thank you so much to Agrologistics. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.